Hello, welcome back to my channel. I'm Arunima Sarin. I recently graduated with a PhD in psychology from Harvard University. In today's video, I'll tell you about the structure of psychology PhD programs in the United States. Whether you're seriously considering doing a PhD or are just curious to understand what that looks like, this video will offer you a comprehensive overview of what to expect. Let's get into it. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is how long PhDs take. A psychology PhD in the United States takes anywhere between 4 to 6 years to complete. How long it takes you to complete, well, it varies, comes down to many different factors. So how complicated your research is, how you're doing with your coursework, what your funding is like, and also whether or not you're doing a clinical PhD. If you're not doing a clinical PhD, then average seems to be 5 to 6 years to graduate. If you intend to do a clinical PhD, then you do all the same number of years as the non-clinical people, plus 1 extra year to do your clinical internship. So the average seems to be about 6 to 7 years for a clinical PhD and about 5 to 6 years for a non-clinical PhD. Moving on to structure. Psychology PhD programs in the United States typically have 3 phases. You have coursework, teaching, and your thesis writing. If you're doing a PhD in clinical psychology, you will have a 4th, and that will be your clinical internship. Now, for the first couple years of your program, you will be attending classes and seminars. Some of these will be made mandatory by your department. A really common mandatory class for grad students is in stats or stats and coding. In addition to those mandatory classes, you will have some flexibility choosing electives that mesh well with your research interests. So at Harvard, for instance, we had a year-long mandatory course in statistics. It's actually statistics in R, and then we could choose from a bunch of different electives. We also had a mandatory departmental seminar where every week one member of our department, our faculty, would come and talk to us about their research. We would read their papers, have a discussion with them, and then write a response paper, which was really fun. Now, the first couple years, because you have to take these classes, can feel a little intense sometimes, especially if you are unfamiliar with some of the material you're engaging in. So it can feel like a lot of work, but I want to quickly highlight 3 really cool things about these first 2 years as a grad student. So the classes and seminars you take are often a lot of work. They can feel like a lot of work. Especially if you are learning skills or engaging with material that you haven't come across before. So it is a lot and can feel like a lot. But there are actually some really cool, fun benefits of this process. And I want to just briefly touch upon 3, especially based on my own experience. The first is that the classes and seminars that you have to take, especially the mandatory ones, are designed to provide you with a solid foundation to be an independent researcher. Classes like statistics or classes in coding especially help you learn skills that are going to be valuable and generalizable. So regardless of what it is that you want to do after grad school, be in academia, not be in academia, those are skills that you can take with you and kind of market anywhere, which is great. A second really cool thing about the classes is that you get exposed to literature that you wouldn't otherwise have engaged with. For instance, in my first year, I took a class in developmental psychology. Now, I am not a developmental psychologist. I study punishment from a social and cognitive point of view, and I would not have sat down to spend a whole semester reading about different research in developmental psychology. So I took the seminar thinking, well, this is going to be a great way to learn about some new stuff I didn't know. And oh my God, it changed how I thought about science completely. When I took it as a first-year grad student, I was lucky enough that it was taught by the absolutely amazing Susan Carey. And that class with her completely changed and reshaped how I thought about research, how I thought about our role as scientists, and the kind of work that I started to engage with, the kind of methodologies I got familiar with. And ultimately, actually, taking that class had an impact on the ways in which I was thinking about my own research, even though didn't want to do any developmental research. And so another really cool benefit of these classes is that you get exposed to new ideas, new work that at the very least is going to be fun to know about, and at the very best might inspire you and actually change the way you are going to do research. A third really fun thing about the classes that you take early on in grad school is that you take it with the rest of your cohort. And because of that, it is a great bonding experience. Everybody has to sit and do the same kind of P-sets or response papers that you are doing. And it's a really fun way to start your graduate school experience. You get to bond with people, work late, maybe get pizzas or beers afterwards. And so it's just a really fun way to start. It's a way where you spend time talking about cool ideas and discussing cool research, and at least for me, getting really inspired by that you get to be around all these smart people and you get to spend your time thinking about research and talking about cool papers and cool work. So it's just a really, really fun experience, even though it is a lot of work. Now, as part of coursework, many programs have qualifying exams. So these are some milestone, some metric that if you pass, upgrades you from a PhD student to a PhD candidate. Different programs structure their qualifying exams, also called quals, differently. Sometimes part of the coursework you attended before could contribute to your quals. Many departments have some kind of particular milestone specifically associated with quals. So for instance, at the Yale Psychology PhD, an important milestone for your quals is writing publication quality theoretical review of the literature. At Harvard, we had to write a second year project report. So this was kind of a mini scientific article about any research we had done in the first 2 years of our PhD. It had to have all the same elements as you would expect in any empirical paper. So an abstract, introduction, methods, results, discussion, conclusion, references, all of that. And we had to then write the report as well as present our research to the entire department. So that included all the faculty members and all the other grad students and postdocs and RAs in the department. That was really scary. It was a really scary experience, but again, it was really, really fun because everyone else in your cohort also has to do those things, and so you often end up working on them together, and you support each other, work through the stresses and the triumphs together. And it's just, again, one of those amazing bonding experiences and a really fun way to get start to carve out your research niche. Now, if you are doing a PhD in clinical psychology, then you will have to do all of this coursework that your non-clinical grad student friends are doing. But in addition to that, you will also have to write an actual exam called the general exam, which is a 6-hour long exam that covers the literature in the field. If you pass all of your seminars and classes and qualifying exams, then you get upgraded to being a PhD candidate. And that brings us to the next phase of your training, teaching. Now, most psychology PhD programs will include some teaching component, so you might end up teaching anywhere between 2 to 3 years, depending on the program and depending on your source of funding. More on that in a minute. Now, when you start teaching, you will most likely be a teaching assistant or a teaching fellow for one of those big undergraduate classes, like an intro to psychology or an intro to stats. In that role, you will often find yourself leading discussions with smaller groups of students, helping them with their labs and problem sets if you're teaching coding or stats. Occasionally, you might help out with a lecture or two or be part of a team collectively putting together a lecture. It can be any of those. The teaching will primarily be geared towards undergrads. Now, teaching has some really great benefits. It gives you a lot of practice in getting good at presenting, organizing your work, organizing your time, in communicating effectively, in kind of striking that balance between warm and friendly but firm. So there's loads of great benefits to teaching. One downside is that it can be incredibly time consuming. It takes a while to become familiar with the class materials that you have to then stand in front of 20 odd undergrads and teach. It's also time consuming because you have to make time to meet with students and answer their emails. You have to grade their assignments or their project reports or look through their code. So teaching's fun, but it can be time consuming. And one thing you need to keep in mind is just kind of balance your time out when you're teaching. Now, one often overlooked benefit of teaching is it helps you realize how much you know. So when I was starting as a grad student, I constantly felt like I didn't know anything, that I didn't know enough literature, that I didn't understand statistics properly enough, that I didn't understand coding well enough. So I just felt like everyone around me knew a lot more and understood everything much better than I did. And I felt that way for a long time. But one thing that helped massively with that was surprisingly teaching. Because when you start teaching, you are teaching undergrads who, for the most part, actually don't know anything about psychology sometimes, or coding or stats, or they know very, very little. And when you start teaching, you realize how much you do know, because they will ask you questions and you will be able to answer them, right? You will know what paper they can look up or what particular statistical analysis would suit the data they're playing around with. I feel like that happens because as grad students, we often we're so focused on all the things that we still have to do and we have to learn that it can be easy to ignore how far you've come, right? It can be easy to overlook everything you have learned. And so I found that in a weird way, being required to teach helped me realize how much I knew. And that was a really great little boost of confidence that came from a source I didn't expect from. And so that's one little upside of teaching. In addition to giving you, again, generalizable, valuable skills, it's a nice little motivation booster. Now, coming back to something I mentioned earlier, there are ways to either get out of teaching or restrict the amount of teaching you have to do. There are broadly two ways to do that. So first is to find roles that count as mentorship. So you're still engaging with undergrads and providing some kind of training or service, but you don't have to teach them. So an example was at Harvard, I worked as a concentration advisor. And in that role, I worked with a team of 5 other advisors. And each of us had to meet with a group of undergraduate students who were majoring in psychology or were interested to major in psychology. And we would meet with them frequently and help them pick their classes and, make sure that they were doing well, that, check in on their well-being and their progress in the course. And that was a really, really fun job. I met some really incredible, inspiring, fun students through that process. I worked with some really wonderful colleagues, and because I was doing that, I could get away with teaching half the load that I would otherwise have to teach. A second way to either completely get out of teaching or just do some minimal amount is to get external funding. So if you get scholarships like scholarship from NSF or NIH, or some other scholarship that basically covers your tuition and your stipend, then you can get away without teaching at all. A downside is that oftentimes these big fellowships, especially the ones that are local to the States, are open only to residents and green card holders of America. And so as an international student, I couldn't even apply. Depending on your nationality, you might have some of these scholarships from your country. I knew someone who, for instance, got a scholarship from Canada. And so you can get away with teaching or minimize the teaching load that you have to do if you can find funding elsewhere or some other kind of role in the department where you don't explicitly have to teach per se. I will say, though, that even if you manage to get some scholarship or external funding that absolves the need for you to teach, I would recommend getting some teaching practice. So doing some kind of teaching still, in part because, It will give you really valuable skills. As scientists, we constantly have to be able to talk about our work to groups of people, at conferences, in lab meetings. And it's a really great way to desensitize yourself a little to standing in front of people and talking. So it just helps you feel more comfortable about even presenting your research, and gives you, a bunch of other good skills like thinking on your feet, presenting, projecting your voice, all of that. In addition to that, it looks really good on your CV. If you want to apply for an academic job, you almost need to have some teaching experience. Most academic jobs ask for a teaching statement explicitly. And it's always nice to have actual experience, so that you can talk about that in your teaching statement. You could talk about your reviews and your philosophy and all of that, and back it up with stuff that you've done. Even if you don't want to be in academia, I feel like teaching still helps. It looks great on your CV because it's a skill that you can market. And so even if you can get away with it, I would still recommend doing some teaching. The final phase of your PhD is your thesis. This is obviously an incredibly important part of your PhD journey. It is the culmination of your original intellectual contribution to the field. And for most PhD students, candidates, the last year and a half is devoted almost exclusively to work directly related to the thesis. Sometimes students have been working on what goes into their thesis from the first year of grad school. Sometimes it takes people a while to figure out exactly what questions they want to ask and the ways in which they want to ask them. But regardless of those differences, in the last year and a half of the program, almost everyone will be prioritizing writing their thesis or finishing up research for their thesis. At some programs, you have to continue teaching during this period. At other programs, like at Harvard, you get your stipend directly in your final thesis year, which is really great because it gives you the opportunity to focus exclusively on just writing and finishing up work for your thesis and not have to worry about anything else. If you are doing a PhD in clinical psychology, then in addition to all of these steps of coursework, teaching, and thesis, you will also have a year-long clinical internship. Now, this is an intense hands-on experience of putting all of your theoretical knowledge to practical use in the real world. And so during this period, you work with clients under the supervision of senior clinicians, typically in hospitals. It's an incredibly challenging year. It's very time-consuming and emotionally consuming. But for the people who've gone through it, it's typically a fantastic way to sharpen their practical skills and also kind of identify and shape their individual identity as clinicians. All right, so that is an overview of the structure of a typical psychology PhD program in the United States, from your coursework and teaching to writing and defending your thesis and potentially doing a clinical internship. Now, depending on the particular university and department you apply to, there might be some minor variations to this structure, but broadly it will be consistent. I hope this video helped demystify what you can expect out of a PhD program. If you found the video insightful and helpful, click the like button and maybe share it with others who might find it helpful. If you're curious about other aspects of the PhD experience, check out my website and stay tuned for more videos where I will talk about other aspects of this experience. Until then, see you next time.